Now, in the past couple of years, Samsung has typically launched two flagship S devices. We've had the regular version and then a Plus version. So for instance, we've had the S8 and the S8 Plus, and similarly, we've had the S9 and the S9 Plus. This year, Samsung has launched three models, the smallest one being the Samsung Galaxy S10e. Now, this phone is aimed directly at the Apple iPhone XR, as in the US, both phones start at roughly $749. However, in India, thanks to Samsung's local manufacturing, the company has managed to get this phone to near dollar value of roughly 55,900 rupees, which is quite impressive. Now, if you've been on the internet of late or even on social media, you've no doubt heard some pretty rave reviews about this phone. So it's finally time to see if the Galaxy S10e is worth the hype. Now, when you compare the Galaxy S10e to, say, the Galaxy S10 or even the Galaxy S10 Plus, you can see that it is the smallest out of the three, and because of that, it is actually incredibly comfortable to hold. You have a really good feel, the frame feels really sturdy and premium, and you have rounded corners everywhere, which leaves you with no sharp edges. Now, all this aluminium and glass can get pretty slippery, but thankfully Samsung bundles in a pretty nice looking case in the box, which is not the case with the S10 and the S10 Plus, where you get the clear transparent case. We quite like this. Now, before we get into the details of the display, there is one slight difference between the S10e and the other two models. Now, with this phone, you get Gorilla Glass 5 on the front and at the back, whereas on the S10 and the S10 Plus, Samsung has used Gorilla Glass 6 on the front and the back is still Gorilla Glass 5. Now, during our usage, we haven't really noticed any scuffs or scratches on the display of the S10e, as Gorilla Glass 5 is also quite resilient to scuffs and even a few drops. But if you are a bit paranoid about this, then you might want to spend a bit more money and get one of the other two phones, which has a better glass protection. Now, while we're on the subject of surviving drops, the S10e did slip from our hand once during our testing period. It wasn't a very big drop, in fact it was less than waist height, and there was no damage done to the front or the back of the glass. However, the aluminium frame did bear most of the brunt of it. As you can see, it did suffer a nasty little scuff mark, which is not going to go away. So you might want to use the case. Now, the display of the S10e is the smallest of the three. It measures 5.8 inches diagonally and it has a full HD plus resolution compared to the Quad HD plus resolution on the other two. However, despite this lower resolution, thanks to the smaller size, it's still pushing more than 400 ppi, which means text and images appear pretty sharp and crisp, so there's no really issue there. Plus, it's the same dynamic AMOLED panel and it also supports HDR10+, which is a bonus. We also like the fact that the display really fills up the entire portion of the screen. There's no ugly notch to break that illusion, and instead you get that Infinity O display or a hole punch in the top of the screen. Unlike the other two models, the S10e doesn't have the curved sides of the S10 and the S10 Plus. Also, the bezels, if you notice, on the either side are slightly thicker than the other two models, but to be very honest, after a few days of using it, we didn't really notice it, and it's really not a big complaint. Now, the really fun part about the hole punch display is that you get to experiment and play around with these really nifty wallpapers, and there are a ton of them. Now, one final thing about the display, there is a screen protector that's pre-applied to the phone, which is nice. However, the edges don't really sit flush to the sides, which means every time you swipe left or right, it tends to graze against your thumb or in your skin, which is not the best feeling. Now, another area where Samsung has cut costs on the Galaxy S10e is the fingerprint sensor. Now, the S10 and the S10 Plus come with in-display ultrasonic fingerprint sensors. However, the S10e, you get a capacitive one that's placed in the power button on the side. Once again, we don't really have any complaints here. We rather prefer the capacitive button as it's more reliable compared to the in-display ones as we've seen so far. And this one's no exception. Now, the fingerprint sensor works well. However, we do feel that the power button should have been slightly lower down, as when you're holding the phone regularly, you have to shuffle around a bit to reach it with your thumb. Now, the fingerprint sensor itself is pretty sensitive. All it needs is a slight tap and you're good to go. And the best part is that you can even enable a gesture which will bring down the notification shade, so it's pretty easy to get to when you're using the phone, especially with one hand. Now, besides the fingerprint sensor, the S10e also has face unlock. Now, unlike the Note 9 and the S9 series which had an iris scanner, the S10 series ditches that since there's not enough room in the hole punch area to accommodate all those sensors. So you're basically left with the selfie camera to authenticate you. Now, don't get me wrong, it works pretty well under good light, and even under low light, the screen brightness is boosted slightly in order to illuminate your face. Now it also has this raise to wake gesture, so the moment you raise the phone to your face, it automatically unlocks the phone, which is pretty cool. However, one thing to note that if you're using the phone during the day in your commute, it doesn't work if you have sunglasses on. Okay, now let's get down to the specifications. Now, even though this is the budget model of the three phones that Samsung announced, there's nothing really budget about the specifications. In fact, the Galaxy S10e has the exact same 8nm Exynos chipset as the other two models. However, in India, the S10e only comes with 6GB of RAM and 128GB of storage, whereas in the US, Samsung has launched a second variant as well, which comes with 8GB of RAM and 256GB of storage. Now, most of the other specifications are pretty standard across all the S10 series. In India, the Galaxy S10e has a hybrid dual SIM slot, which is placed on the top, so you can use either 2 nano SIMs or 1 SIM and a micro SD card. Now, the phone also has AKG tuned stereo speakers. There's one at the bottom and there's one in the earpiece. It's also IP68 certified for dust and water resistance, and you also get a whole bunch of sensors. Now, the Galaxy S10e runs on One UI 1.1, which is based on Android 9 Pie. Now, we've seen this UI on previous Samsung phones as well in the recent past, and it's a lot nicer and is something we really like. Now, the interface does keep Android Pie's native features such as digital well-being, and it also adds a whole bunch of gestures and shortcuts which can be activated if needed. Now, you can get rid of the standard navigation bar too in favor of gestures. Now, performance is great. Despite having 2GB lesser RAM than the other two models, we didn't really notice any difference in day-to-day usage or even in benchmark numbers. However, we did notice one thing, that the sides of the phone tend to get warm pretty easily, and at times we even noticed this when we were simply downloading apps from the Play Store. Now, this isn't a consistent issue, and if you're probably going to use the bundled case, you're never going to notice it. However, it's just something to be aware about. Now, the phone is great for gaming too. It's a perfect size to hold in your hand, and even high-end titles such as PUBG Mobile run absolutely fine on the highest settings with smooth frame rates. Now, the stereo speakers of the Galaxy S10e sound pretty good. You get Dolby Atmos that's not only reserved for the headphones but also work for stereo speakers, and it does improve the spatial separation of audio a bit. You also get bundled AKG headphones in the box, which, just like the S10 Plus, sound really good on this phone. Cameras have always been the strong point of Samsung's flagship phones, and the S10 is no exception. In fact, we recently did a comparison of the S10 Plus versus the current flagships, and it fared pretty well. Now, the good news is that the Samsung Galaxy S10e has the exact same front and rear cameras as the S10 and the S10 Plus, minus the telephoto sensor. Now, unsurprisingly, the performance is quite similar too. The phone captures detailed landscapes and macros in daylight. You also get that scene optimizer, which automatically recognizes objects like sneakers, t-shirts, etc. and tries its best to enhance the image. The macros are also highly detailed and exposure is handled pretty well. Now, the camera app is also pretty easy to use and all the elements are pretty well laid out. The toggle to switch between the regular and the wide-angle sensor is within reach of your thumb, and you can switch through the shooting modes by simply flicking across the viewfinder, and there are plenty of them, both for stills and video. Live focus works pretty well too, with good edge detection, and you can even add background effects. Now, the selfie camera is a big improvement over the Note 9 and the S9 series too, and despite not having the RGB depth sensor like the S10 Plus, the Galaxy S10e still does a pretty decent job with detecting edges of selfies. Video recording hasn't been compromised too. You can shoot at 4K up to 60 FPS, and the image quality is pretty good in daylight and even in low light, along with good stabilization. Now, the S10e has a 3100 mAh battery, which is the smallest of the lot, and that has an effect in everyday use too. Now, we normally managed to get a roughly 17 to 18 hours of actual usage, which involved a bit of camera and video viewing, but mostly browser and chat apps. This is still good as you can still comfortably get through a full workday, but not enough to go beyond the 24-hour mark. The good news is the battery charges pretty quickly too. Now, with a 5% charge and the bundle charger, we were able to get up to nearly 95% in just 1 hour. The phone also supports wireless charging, and you also get reverse wireless charging, so you can charge other Qi compatible devices just using this phone. Now, the Galaxy S10e may not have all the frills of the S10 and the S10 Plus, but at 55,900 rupees, it retains just enough of features of the other two to make it very good value. In India, it's a much better deal compared to the iPhone XR, not only in terms of features but also in price. The closest competition to the S10e at the moment seems to be the Pixel 3, which can be found for around 58,000 rupees online. Now, unless you really want pure stock Android, then you could go for the Pixel, else the S10e is still the better pick. Now, we can see why the S10e has been garnering such praise. You get most of the guts of the S10 and the S10 Plus in a body that's a lot more compact and manageable. Battery life is not as good as the other models, and you do lose out on the telephoto sensor. So if these two things matter, then it does make sense to spend a little bit more money and get the S10 or the S10 Plus. But overall, we think most people will be more than satisfied with the Galaxy S10e, especially at this price. So thanks for watching our review, and for all things tech, log on to gadgets360.com.